Let me ask you a question before we go any further. What if the most important geopolitical shift of this decade is not happening in Taiwan, not happening in Ukraine, not even happening in Washington or Beijing, but in a narrow strip of water most people could not locate on a map without Google? Because that is the thing about history. The events that change the world rarely announce themselves with fireworks. They happen quietly at first, gradually, then suddenly all at once, and by the time the average person notices, the architecture of global power has already been rearranged behind closed doors, while everyone else was distracted by headlines designed for emotional reaction instead of strategic understanding. And right now, in the waters surrounding the Strait of Hormuz, something extraordinary is unfolding. Not a war, not yet. Something far more dangerous than that. A transition, a transfer of influence so subtle that most Western audiences have barely registered it. But once you see the pattern, once you connect the dots that at first glance appear unrelated, you realize you are watching the early stages of a geopolitical revolution that could redefine who controls the global economy for the next generation. Because think carefully about what power actually means in the 21st century. Most people still imagine power the old way. Aircraft carriers, fighter jets, missile systems, soldiers marching in formation beneath national flags. That is how the 20th century taught us to think about empires. But China studied the 20th century very carefully, and Beijing reached a conclusion that Washington still struggles to fully understand. Military dominance is expensive. Military dominance creates resistance. Military dominance forces countries to choose sides openly. But economic dependency, infrastructure dependency, energy dependency, those create something much more durable because countries can participate in them while pretending they are still neutral. And nowhere is that strategy more visible than in the Persian Gulf. Now here is where the story becomes uncomfortable for the United States because the American position in the Gulf was never supposed to be temporary. Ever since the Carter Doctrine in 1980, Washington operated under a simple assumption. The Persian Gulf would remain under American security management indefinitely because the global economy depended on it. That assumption survived the collapse of the Soviet Union. It survived the Iraq wars. It survived terrorism, insurgencies, oil shocks, financial crises, and political upheaval across the Middle East. Presidents changed, strategies changed, but one thing never changed. America remained the guarantor of Gulf stability because without Gulf stability, the modern industrial economy begins to shake at its foundations. But there is a hidden contradiction inside that arrangement, and China identified it years ago while most Western policymakers were still treating Beijing primarily as a manufacturing hub rather than a civilizational competitor. The contradiction is this. America pays the cost of securing the sea lanes, but increasingly China receives the economic benefit. Chinese factories need Gulf oil. Chinese trade routes depend on Gulf stability. Chinese growth relies on uninterrupted energy flows moving through Hormuz every single day. Yet it is American sailors, American taxpayers, and American military infrastructure carrying the burden of keeping those routes open. That imbalance could only last as long as the American public accepted it. And Beijing understands domestic political fatigue better than many American strategists do, because China has spent decades studying not just American military power, but American psychology, American political polarization, American exhaustion after 20 years of war in the Middle East. The growing sentiment among ordinary Americans that maybe it is no longer their responsibility to police the world while rivals benefit economically from the stability the U.S. provides. So China began preparing for the moment when that exhaustion transforms into policy. Not dramatically, not recklessly, quietly. And this is where people consistently underestimate Beijing, because Western political systems are trained to focus on election cycles, immediate crises, quarterly growth reports, and media narratives that reset every 48 hours. China thinks differently. China thinks in decades. It builds systems slowly enough that by the time they become strategically obvious, reversing them becomes nearly impossible. Look at Gwadar Port in Pakistan. Years ago, many analysts dismissed it as another oversized Belt and Road vanity project, a flashy infrastructure investment that would never fully deliver on its promises. But now the calculus looks different because Gwadar is no longer just a port. It is a strategic foothold connected to Western China through economic corridors that bypass vulnerable maritime chokepoints. Suddenly, what looked commercial begins to look geopolitical, and what looked geopolitical starts looking military adjacent without ever formally becoming military at all. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Because if China announced tomorrow that it was building a formal naval-based network across the Gulf, the reaction from Washington would be immediate and aggressive. Alliances would harden overnight. Sanctions discussions would begin instantly. Military planners would shift resources into the region. Beijing understands this perfectly, so instead it operates below the threshold that traditionally triggers strategic panic. Commercial ports, logistics hubs, infrastructure partnerships, telecommunications agreements, energy deals. Everything appears economically rational when viewed individually. That is the genius of it. The strategy only becomes alarming when viewed collectively. And most governments are terrible at recognizing cumulative strategic shifts because bureaucracies analyze problems in compartments. Energy departments study oil, trade departments study investment, military analysts study naval exercises, diplomats study bilateral relations. But China's strategy works precisely because it integrates all of those domains simultaneously, while Western institutions often evaluate them separately. So while Washington debates tariffs and semiconductor restrictions, Beijing is building influence inside the arteries of global energy itself. Now, pause for a second and think about Iran, because Iran is central to understanding the deeper game being played here. For decades, American sanctions policy relied on a core assumption. Economic isolation would eventually pressure Tehran into strategic compromise. Maybe not quickly, maybe not cleanly, but eventually the weight of isolation would force Iran back toward negotiations on terms favorable to the West. China quietly shattered that assumption. Not through speeches, through purchases. Because when China began buying massive volumes of Iranian oil despite sanctions pressure, it fundamentally changed Tehran's strategic time horizon. Suddenly, Iran no longer faced the same urgency. The economic suffocation Washington expected never fully materialized because Beijing provided an alternative financial oxygen supply. And that changed everything, because patience is power in geopolitics. The actor who can wait longer often wins. Iran learned it could survive. China learned it could gain leverage without firing a shot. And the United States learned something deeply uncomfortable. Sanctions lose effectiveness in a multipolar economic system where rival powers are willing to create parallel networks of trade outside Western control. That realization has enormous implications far beyond the Middle East. Because what happens if this model expands? What happens if more countries conclude that alignment with China offers protection from Western economic pressure? What happens if Beijing becomes the indispensable commercial partner for nations that want access to global markets without dependence on American approval? Suddenly, this is not just about oil anymore. It is about the future architecture of global influence. And here is the part almost nobody wants to say openly. China may not need to surpass the United States militarily to become the dominant power in key regions of the world. It may simply need to become economically unavoidable. That is a very different type of empire. Historically, empires occupied territory. China occupies supply chains. Historically, empires conquered populations. China integrates markets. Historically, empires demanded ideological loyalty. China often asks only for commercial cooperation. And because of that, countries can deepen ties with Beijing while still publicly maintaining relationships with Washington. That flexibility is extraordinarily attractive for middle powers in the Gulf because it allows them to hedge. They do not have to choose one side completely. They can continue relying on American security guarantees while simultaneously integrating economically with China. From their perspective, that is rational. From Washington's perspective, it slowly erodes the exclusivity of American influence. And the Gulf states understand the world is changing faster than many American policymakers do. Look at Saudi Arabia. 20 years ago, the idea that Riyadh would deepen strategic coordination with Beijing while simultaneously maintaining its American alliance would have seemed contradictory. Today, it looks pragmatic. The UAE is doing the same thing. Oman is doing the same thing. Even countries traditionally anchored inside the American security orbit are diversifying because they sense the international system entering a transitional era where relying entirely on one superpower suddenly looks risky. China did not create that uncertainty. It exploited it. That is what sophisticated strategy looks like. You do not force history. You position yourself to benefit from the direction history is already moving. And the terrifying thing for Washington is that China's strategy becomes stronger the more America overextends itself elsewhere. Every crisis demanding U.S. military attention creates additional opportunities for Beijing to deepen commercial influence quietly in the background. Ukraine absorbs Western resources and political bandwidth. Tensions in the Pacific absorb military planning capacity. Domestic political division absorbs institutional focus. And while the United States is constantly reacting to emergencies, China keeps building infrastructure, ports, energy agreements, digital payment systems, telecommunications networks, shipping corridors, long-term industrial partnerships, the kind of structures that remain in place regardless of who wins the next election cycle. This is why the naval exercises with Iran and Russia matter far more than most headlines suggested. Not because those exercises alone threaten American naval supremacy, they do not. The U.S. Navy remains overwhelmingly dominant, but dominance is not the same thing as uncontested influence. And what China is doing is slowly normalizing its strategic presence in waters that Washington long treated as effectively its own operational environment. Normalization is powerful, because the first time a rival power appears in a region, it creates alarm. The fifth time, it creates familiarity. Eventually, what once seemed extraordinary begins to feel routine. That psychological transition matters enormously in geopolitics, because once regional actors emotionally adjust to a multipolar environment, their behavior changes permanently. And China understands perception better than many people realize. Beijing does not necessarily need Gulf countries to abandon America. It only needs them to believe America may eventually retreat. Once that doubt exists, even quietly, every government in the region begins hedging automatically. Every hedge creates additional Chinese influence. Every additional layer of influence creates more hedging. It becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. Now imagine where this leads 10 years from now if current trends continue. Imagine a Persian Gulf, where Chinese companies operate critical port infrastructure across multiple countries, where Gulf energy exports increasingly flow eastward under long-term yuan-denominated agreements, where regional governments maintain security ties with Washington but depend economically on Beijing, where Chinese naval deployments become routine under the justification of protecting trade routes and commercial assets. At that point, the balance of influence changes even if American aircraft carriers remain physically present. Because influence is not only about military capability, it is about who regional actors believe their future prosperity depends on. And there is another layer to this that makes the situation even more consequential. Technology. Because China is not just building physical infrastructure, it is building digital infrastructure, smart ports, surveillance systems, telecommunications architecture, financial transaction networks, data integration platforms. The future economy will run not only on oil but on information, logistics coordination, predictive supply chain management, and digital connectivity. Whoever shapes those systems shapes the rules of commerce itself. Western policymakers still sometimes treat infrastructure as if it is politically neutral. China does not. Beijing understands infrastructure creates dependency because once entire economies are wired into a system, changing that system becomes incredibly expensive and politically disruptive. That is why Belt and Road matters despite all the criticism it receives. People focus on debt problems or failed projects, but they miss the broader strategic purpose. Even imperfect infrastructure can create long-term political gravity. And gravity matters because global influence in the 21st century increasingly resembles a network rather than a battlefield. The countries connected most deeply into the network gain leverage over everyone else inside it. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely dangerous, because history shows that transitions between dominant powers are rarely smooth. especially when the established power does not fully recognize the nature of the challenge early enough. The United States still largely thinks in military terms because American supremacy was built on military primacy after World War II. But China is competing asymmetrically. It is competing commercially, financially, infrastructurally, and diplomatically all at once. That does not mean military power no longer matters. Of course it matters. But China is attempting to make military confrontation unnecessary by reshaping the surrounding environment gradually before any direct conflict becomes unavoidable. And if that strategy succeeds, the implications stretch far beyond the Persian Gulf. Because Hormuz is a laboratory, a proving ground, a prototype for how China may approach other strategically vital regions around the world. Africa, the Indian Ocean, Latin America, even parts of Europe. The same pattern repeats. Economic integration first, infrastructure second, political relationships third. Strategic influence emerges almost invisibly over time. And by the time competitors fully recognize what happened, reversing it becomes extraordinarily difficult because the system no longer depends on coercion alone. It depends on mutual economic incentives. That is why simplistic Cold War comparisons fail so badly here. The Soviet Union projected influence through ideology and military alignment. China projects influence through commerce and interdependence. Those are fundamentally different models, which means traditional containment strategies may not work the way policymakers expect. You cannot easily contain a country that is your largest trading partner. You cannot easily isolate a country deeply embedded in global manufacturing and energy networks. You cannot easily pressure allies to decouple from an economy their own prosperity increasingly depends on. And China knows this. Which brings us to the question nobody in Washington seems comfortable answering honestly. What exactly is the long-term American strategy here? Because maintaining naval supremacy indefinitely is expensive. Maintaining global alliances indefinitely is expensive. Maintaining simultaneous military commitments in Europe, the Pacific, and the Middle East, while domestic debt rises and political consensus fractures, becomes harder every year. China sees those pressures accumulating, and Beijing is betting that time favors patience over confrontation. But here is the part that should really make policymakers nervous. China may not even need America to decline absolutely. Relative decline is enough. Strategic hesitation is enough. Perception of reduced commitment is enough. Empires are not judged only by raw capability, they are judged by confidence. The moment allies begin quietly questioning whether the dominant power will still be there 20 years from now, the geopolitical landscape starts shifting beneath everyone's feet. And in the Gulf, that questioning has already begun. Not publicly, not dramatically, quietly, which is exactly how China prefers it. Because the most effective geopolitical transformations are the ones that look inevitable only in retrospect. The ones where historians later say the signs were obvious, even though almost nobody treated them seriously at the time. And right now, the signs are everywhere. The naval drills, the port agreements, the energy relationships, the financial coordination, the infrastructure networks. Individually, they look manageable. Collectively, they form something much larger. A parallel architecture of influence emerging inside one of the most strategically important regions on Earth. And the truly unsettling part is that this may only be the beginning, because there is one more dimension to China's strategy in the Gulf that almost nobody is talking about yet. A dimension that could fundamentally alter not just who controls energy flows, but who controls the rules of global trade itself. And once that process reaches a certain threshold, reversing it may become impossible.